Welcome everybody here. My name is Meredith Gamer. I teach in the art history department here at Columbia. And it is a tremendous pleasure to be here with all of you and to be celebrating the publication of Emily's wonderful and important book. And as some of you may know, this was an event that was scheduled for the spring and then was delayed. So it's just wonderful to actually be here with everyone. So I want to begin by acknowledging our event sponsors, which are the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Motherhood and Technology Working Group at the Center for the Study of Social Difference. And I also want to just also thank Arden Hegeli, who's here, and who was a key actor in bringing us all together tonight and in organizing this event. Is that right? And Rishi. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Okay, so we're going to start with Emily. So Emily C. Bloom is an assistant professor at Sarah Lawrence College, where she teaches literature. Her book, The Wireless Past, Anglo-Irish Writers and the BBC, 1931 to 1968, was awarded the first book prize by the Modernist Studies Association. She has previously taught at Columbia University, the U.S. Air Force Academy, Georgia State University, and most recently, she coordinated the lifelong learning programs at the Wartburg Adult Care Community in Mount Vernon, New York, as a Mellon Public Humanities Fellow. She has published on the topics of care, disability, technology, and modernism in a range of publications, including the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Public Books, LitHub, and the Irish Times. Randy Hutter Epstein is a medical writer and serves, I'm going to introduce everyone all at once, right? And then we'll go through. Okay. So Randy Epstein is a medical writer and serves at Yale University as the writer in residence at the medical school and lecturer in the English department. She is also an adjunct professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Randy has worked as a medical writer for the London Bureau of the Associated Press and was the London Bureau Chief of Physicians Weekly. She is also the author of Get Me Out, A History of Childbirth from the Garden of Eden to the Sperm Bank, and Aroused, The History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. Okay, Sayantani Dasgupta is a faculty member in the master's program in narrative medicine, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, all at Columbia University. Originally trained in pediatrics and public health, her work has appeared in journals including The Lancet, JAMA, Pediatrics, the Hastings Center Report, Literature and Medicine, Teaching and Learning in Medicine, and the Journal of Medical Humanities. And finally, Rachel Adams, who specializes in 20th and 21st century literature of the United States and the Americas, disability studies and health humanities, media studies, theories of race, gender, and sexuality, and food studies. Her most recent book is Raising Henry, a memoir of motherhood, disability, and discovery, published by Yale Press in 2013 and winner of the 2014 Delta Kappa Gamma Educators Award. She is also the author of Continental Divides, Remapping the Cultures of North America, and Sideshow USA, Freaks and the American Cultural Imagination. She is co-editor with Benjamin Rees and David Serlin of Keywords for Disability Studies, and co-editor with David Sevran of the Masculinity Studies Reader. She is also the editor of a critical edition of Kate Chopin's The Awakening. Please join me in welcoming Emily and Randy and Sayantani and Rachel.
Okay, I think I start. Is that right? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for being here today. This is a very special event to me because, as some of you might know, I used to work here at the Society Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities. And many of the experiences that I describe in my book happened between the hours I was sitting in my office 2 floors down or attending events in this space. So I want to begin by expressing my thanks to the folks who do so much invisible labor to make these events possible. Thank you to Lindsay Schramm, Erin Fay, Sylvia Gindick, and Eileen Galuli, and everyone else who has worked or at any point in this building. Thank you all so much. So this room is sort of somewhat charged with the ghosts of 2016 for me, because that's the year I started working here, which happened to also be a year of a presidential election. That was the year that I started working here, and I was here from 2016 to about 2019. And it was also in this space that I met many people who would encourage me in the writing of this book. So thank you to Arden Hagley, who I met as a fellow in the Society of Fellows, and Rishi Goyal, who together formed the Motherhood and Technology Working Group, which played a key role in shaping the intellectual trajectory of this project, as well as putting me in contact with many of the amazing interlocutors on this panel today. When I started writing this book, I had recently stepped down from my job here after my daughter was diagnosed with diabetes just after her first birthday. After the diabetes diagnosis, my husband, daughter, and I moved back to my hometown without any sense of how we were going to come back or whether I would be able to return to an academic career in English literature. Amidst all that uncertainty and upheaval, I decided to write a book. It was not the most rational thing to do, as I remind myself over and over again, as I have to talk about myself so very much. It was not the rational thing to do during a pandemic while caring for a child with complex medical needs. But I wrote it in part because I felt like I had something that I wanted to say about the widening gap between the expectations placed on parents, and women especially, and the support available to them. So I wrote about common and not so common experiences: miscarriage, the diagnosis of a rare genetic disorder, raising a deaf daughter with a hard of hearing spouse, and managing diabetes. We were exceptionally lucky to be able to access treatments and interventions and devices for each of these diagnoses. But each treatment also carried a significant cognitive and financial burden and required an additional outlay in terms of care labor. I wanted to write about being the beneficiary of so many scientific and technological interventions, but also about how these tools created new forms of labor that often go unnoticed. It took me a while to admit that I was writing a memoir, and longer still to find the shape that the book would take. I knew that I wanted to apply the things that I loved about studying and teaching literature and history and art to my lived experience. This was a very medicalized time in my life, a time of failed pregnancies and testing and diagnoses and hospital stays. In the end, I structured each chapter around the medical devices and tools that I encountered on my path to and through parenthood, from pregnancy tests to cochlear implants to glucose monitors, and dove into the social history of these devices. I wanted to think of these medical tools as artifacts among other artifacts, including works of art, each of which provide a different way of understanding motherhood. And so I went about making connections, sometimes wild connections, between pregnancy tests and paintings of the Annunciation, between genetic testing and Sophocles' Oedipus, between cochlear implants and Laurie Anderson's music. Through these connections, I pushed myself to understand what it means to live with uncertainty, to not know how a pregnancy or a life will turn out, and to let go of the illusion that I could control, to use a phrase I take from Louise Bourgeois, everything forever. At the end of the day, I always intended this book to be a love story of sorts. It's a love story to my amazing daughter, who is the beating heart of the book, to my incredible husband, who is the reason I wrote it at all, to my friends and family who have been through similar and different experiences with pregnancy and parenthood, and who allowed me to share their stories. And it is a love letter to the humanities and a defense of humanistic inquiry as a way of understanding our world. And so it is with gratitude that I return to the place where so many of these ideas were first incubated. And I thank you all for being with us today.
So for those of you who've already read the book, and those, I mean, we all know it's a beautiful, it's so smart, and there's so much medicine and science and history, but the compassion just shines through. That's not a question, that's a comment. But and then I have one comment and then a question. I mean, the one comment I also wanted to say is, in this day of, I guess I've heard the word sharenting, with parents oversharing and putting photographs. You're so careful. You don't even use your daughter's name in the book. And it really is your memoir. I felt that, and you can comment on this too, but I felt you're very protective in the way you describe her. We don't know what she looks like. We don't know a lot about her. This is your experience. And I did mark down one comment that I thought, if I can find it right now, that you put it beautifully, in terms of, even when you talk about I probably have it memorized by now, but when you talk about your reluctance to get her a pump, which might be so easy. And I just want to quote this from your book on page 249. And I just thought this shows this love and empathy and protection at the same time. And Emily, this is you writing. I often asked myself why I was reluctant to get a piece of technology with such obvious benefits. This is about diabetes. Part of it was a fear of rocking the boat. I'm skipping a few lines, but that wasn't the real reason. I looked at Willie's small body. Willie's not her real name. As I dressed her in her pajamas for bed, the green light of her hearing aids blinked back at me, not yet completely covered by the blonde hair that was slowly starting to grow. But the greatest advantage of the pen needle, and the reason that I was not ready to get her the pump, was that the needle is something that I can carry. It does not need to live in Willie's body. She is carrying enough already. There's such a respect. There's such a respect for her privacy, for her individuality. Maybe you can comment a bit on how, if you had to grapple with that writing the book, if you wrote things and then thought, no, I'm going to take that out, how is she going to think about that? So I'd love for you to comment on that. And then the other thing you talked about just now in your introduction, the humanistic inquiry and the connections. And I just found, knowing that you have a PhD in English, which I don't, but assuming that when people that do have PhDs in English or in the humanities, you're always looking for metaphors and a deeper reading of the text. It felt to me, as I've read and reread this book, that you were using, I could be wrong, but I want some of the skills that you, as a doctorate in English, on your own life, in terms of you, for instance, you talk about going to MoMA and you're looking at Dadaist art. You're looking at a piece of art covered with white circles dotted in the center, like toilet paper rolls seen above, or like a zygote with a black center. And you go from there to talking about your experience of genetic testing. And you go from there talking about the history and Rosalind Franklin and how she was left out. And I can go on and on. That's just one of many. But I'm wondering if this was something you consciously did, or it just kind of came naturally to you. So I don't know, do we all go, or should she answer? How are we?
I don't know. My
questions
thought,
might overlap.
yeah,
Maybe do all the
my
questions
thought
so we
was
get to
everybody would
everyone.
go. Yeah, do all the questions, and then Emily, does that work for you, Emily? Yeah, okay, great. And then we'll kind of get it all out. And
Excellent. Thank you, Randy. So Emily and I just met, and I said, oh, can I give you a hug? I feel like I know you have read your memoir. And Emily in turn said, well, I wish I'd read your diaries. And so in order to, and Emily didn't know this, but in order to kind of pay back that impulse, I'm going to start with myself and my own reactions to the book, and then go to some questions which are going to be overlapping with some of Randy's as well. So Emily, what reading your book really brought me to was the question that maybe 2 decades ago brought me to the work I do now, which is, what's the connection between voice and body? right? As a daughter of Indian immigrants to the US, it was novels, essays, plays, and poems, the literary things that are the bread and butter of your life, which introduced me to myself. I remember reading Paul Marshall's Brown Girl Brownstones for the first time as a teenager, probably, and thinking, this is what it is to be a young brown girl in America. This is what it is to be me. Marshall's words were not my exact experience, to be sure, but they gave me a space, a recognition, a permission to be. So from Tagore to Sharon Olds, from Alice Walker to Rushdie, authors of various personal, political, national boundaries taught me how to better understand my own, as did you here. Like looking into a mirror, to use an image from Rushdie, like peering into the stream of stories. The voices of these writers taught me how to live in my own skin. They introduced me to my own face. So what's the relationship of voice to body? Later, as a writer of a terrible memoir, which no one should read, and much creative nonfiction, I would often write about my embodied experiences as I went through medical training and motherhood. Not just that, I would write from and through that embodied experience as a nursing mother. 20 years ago, I perfected the art of typing while nursing. If I sat just so on my bed with my left elbow curled around the baby's head, I could reach the laptop keyboard with both hands and clickety-clack away while my infant fed. My words and images competed for my time with my babies, but they were all beloved and all of my body, both my flesh and blood children and their insisting to be heard, literary siblings. When I turned to writing children's fiction, inspired by Indian folk tales and mythologies, I pulled back on my medical and academic career at that point, and this was something I felt deep resonance with in your text, to write not as a choice or a fancy, but of necessity. I could write from home, where my now adult children then needed me to be. I wrote and still write those stories to remember the tales told to me by grandmothers long gone, whispered like magical mantras under the mosquito net, where I would sleep on my vacations to India. I wrote those fantastical tales of demons and wolves, princesses and ghosts, to remember my foremothers, to introduce my children to their ancient streams of stories, and ultimately to narrate and re-narrate myself into being. What's the connection between voice and body? So in my academic life here in this institution, as one of the founders of the narrative medicine program here at Columbia, as someone who's been working on illness memoir, so I co-edited a volume called Stories of Illness and Healing, Women Write Their Bodies. I've been in the business of studying illness and disability memoirs for the greater part of 2 decades. And one of the questions I ask my students is, who and what are such narratives for? Sociologist Arthur Frank calls illness memoirs as emerging out of a writer's need for a new destination and map, after what he terms the narrative wreckage of illness, trauma, and other major life changes that alter the course of one's life trajectory. But of course, any memoirist must discover truths about their own experiences by virtue of the writing process. As Joan Didion says, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking and what I'm looking for, what I'm looking at, what I see, what it means, what I want, and what I fear. But of course, maybe, memoirs are equally an examination of the self as they are the non-self and the unfamiliar, as much the familiar as the unfamiliar. And so in addition to Didion's observation, I think I'll just throw in the great Toni Morrison, who said the ability of writers to imagine what is not the self, to familiarize the strange and mystify the familiar, is the test of their power. And that, I think, is the power of this book. So I often, in my class, I make this connection between voice and body for my students. In particular, I'm interested in what you did, which is the political act of speaking from, about, and through marginalized bodies, right? Because gay bodies, disabled bodies, immigrant bodies, bodies of color, working bodies, queer bodies, trans bodies, we are all told to be quiet. And doing so, uphold the tyranny of the normative. In speaking, writing, telling, we light the collective spark of our activism. I'm also really, and I'm going to get to it in like 2 secs, deeply interested in the act of not speaking. What poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant calls the right to opacity. But I'm going to ask you about that in like 3 seconds. But what instead I'd like to draw attention to is something that you do beautifully, which is use your words to call for community. Words of writer Nancy Mears, who writes autobiographically about having multiple sclerosis and using a wheelchair. Paradoxically, losing one sort of move has given me another. No one's going to take my breath away. No one's going to leave me speechless. To be silent is to comply with the standard of feminine grace, but my crippled body already violates all notions of feminine grace. What have I got to lose? No body, no voice, no voice, no body. That is what I know in my bones. And writing and publishing about her life, Mears describes drawing others to her, getting phone calls, and I want to know about this, getting phone calls and letters which declare, me too, me too. And she writes, it says, though the part I thought was a solo turned out to be a chorus, but none of us was singing loud enough for the others to hear. So Emily, I feel like your memoir sings loudly. It sings beautifully. It sings of parenthood and pregnancy. It sings of reproductive choice. It sings of family and friendship, of defining and redefining the self. It sings of our inherent interdependency as human beings. And I also think it does something that's key to the work of narrative medicine, which is it tells individual stories in collective and structural contexts, right? Whether it's oralism, the history of oralism, the technical history of cochlear implants, the discovery of pancreatic islet cells, the specter of eugenics, the tensions of the social and medical models of disability. The stories of your individuals, yourself, your family members in the text are always in conversation and in context with social power and historical precedent. No one, as it were, falls out of the coconut tree, right? They live in the context of all in which they live and that which came before them. Kamala Harris. Or Kamala Harris's mom, I guess. So these are my couple of questions I'd like to kind of end with. The question that Randy kind of posed to you, a question that Rachel and I have, been engaging together with for a long time, which is what are the ethics of life writing about family members, in particular minor children, and how do we negotiate as readers and writers the changing ethics, not only as times change, but as those children grow and decide how to tell their story. Related, in his Far From the Tree, Andrew Solomon talks about vertical identities, those identities shared between marginalized identities shared between children and parents, and horizontal identities, identities that not shared by a natal family. It's kind of unfair to me to be like, solve this problem, Emily. Is there a different responsibility when talking about one, like a shared identity versus another, not shared identity? Once wrote in her cancer journals that silence has never given us anything of worth, and yet she wrote those words at a time that she had breast cancer, and it was still called like the C word, right? And women were still going and getting mastectomies without, knowing what was happening to them, right? It was a different time period, and now we're living kind of post-golden age of memoir. So going back to this issue of opacity, there is a real voyeuristic demand for minoritized memoirists to tell and tell and tell some more and give out deeply personal details of painful incidents. So when did you find it better to resist telling, and how did you negotiate kind of telling and not telling? And finally, I guess I wanted to hear about how your memoir has been received by communities who share multiple identities with you. Have there been moments of Me Too, such that the part you thought was a solo turned out to be a chorus?
You can use either one of these, just make sure it's on.
And is this?
That's fine, just turn it on. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm so happy to be here. For many reasons, but two of them. So, first of all, when you're talking to a friend and they say, you know, oh, I'm having this experience and I might write about it one day. And then like years later, you find yourself with that. My book is in my bag, but the book in front of you and you're there to celebrate that book. It's just a really beautiful thing. And I feel so lucky to have been along, like around the edges of this journey and to see where it's led us. I was so devastated last spring when we had to cancel this event, but it actually gave me the opportunity to reread the book so I could write about it fresh. And so in some ways, I'm glad we're doing this now. Okay, so very quickly, I have some thoughts and questions of my own. So I'm going to start with Emily's own voice. If a camera were to record us with one long exposure, Emily Bloom writes, describing her family cuddling in bed, it would trace these moving creatures as two wobbly vertical lines with a restless horizontal pattern shifting between them. We would appear before the eye of the camera as an imperfect double helix, marking our way through the passage of time. Like so many passages in this beautiful new book, this one captures in a few graceful sentences many of the larger themes of the story. The unavoidable entanglement of technology with modern reproduction and parenting, the promises and perils of those technologies, what they can and cannot tell us about the value of a life, the burdens and gifts of inheritance, and the enduring love of a family. Of course, the human bodies nestled on the bed look like an imperfect double helix, because Bloom is writing of a time when genetic science is inescapable, especially if you want to become a parent, especially if you have any kind of trouble with conception, especially if your family carries multiple meaningfully atypical sequences. A giant strand of DNA, this family appears like a magnified version of the imperfect double helixes that both connect and distinguish them from one another. As a photograph of a double helix, perhaps they also evoke the figure of Rosalind Franklin, who took the picture that allowed Watson and Crick to devise the structure of DNA, but whose contribution was inadequately acknowledged because of sexism, workplace hostilities, and untimely death. This kind of reading is inspired by Emily's own method in this book, which moves back and forth like a double helix, winding together her more recent experiences as a parent, her family's past, and the history of science and the technologies that have entangled every step of this journey. Among the many themes summoned up by this image of the double helix, my favorite, and maybe the place where my own research most intersects with Emily's, concerns the joys and frustrations of an inescapable interdependency at every level, from the molecular to the planetary. So that will be the focus of my last minute or two. Interdependency. At one level, interdependency describes the relation of mother and child, especially when the mother is also the biological parent who conceived, carried, and bore that child. Beginning with her multiple attempts to get pregnant and bring a child to term, Emily is acutely attentive to a form of interdependency rooted in, but not limited to, a bodily relationship. This interdependency has limits. The interdependency of mother and child makes room for the other parents, an equal contributor to Willie's genetic makeup and a full, if asymmetrical, contributor to the work of caregiving. Emily adores her child, but also has needs and desires that exceed motherhood. Her work as a writer, a teacher, and a social being. These desires are frustrated by her child's need for extra care, just at the time when she might become more independent. Her impairments bind her to her parents in new ways. I should probably have, if they're frustrated, they also produce, you know, I don't know which of the the banal words, that wisdom, joys of their own, but you know that, but you can talk about that. That brings me to a second form of interdependency threaded through the book, that of the human body with the technologies that sustain and enhance it. The arc of Emily's story is roughly chronological, but each chapter also takes on one of the many technologies that assume an important role in her life. These run from pregnancy tests to prenatal diagnostic tests to genetic sequencing to IVF to technologies to test hearing and address its loss to those that diagnose, monitor, and treat diabetes. Some of these are now standard parts of modern parenting, and others are a result of the particular embodied experiences of this family. The glucose monitor, the shots in the belly that leave purple bruises, the tiny hearing aids. And the presence of those technologies in the story lead me to yet a third form of interdependency brought into relief by the particular vulnerabilities experienced by Willie and her parents. The double helix of this loving family is not self-enclosed, but branches and winds outward. They are embedded in broader networks of care that include family and friends, healthcare professionals, technologists of various kinds, therapists, teachers, childcare workers, and other parents. As Emily shows time and again, those networks are all essential to the well-being of her family, but they are also varied and particular depending on the proximity, needs, and circumstances of each caring relationship. Okay, so I probably should have prepared more questions, but here's what I'll say in closing. So if you would like to respond, Emily, I would ask you to talk about interdependency as a theme in your story, but also as a social problem. And on this theme of like the mixed meanings, you know, maybe an opportunity to explain to us how you imagine its pertinence to the related terms independence and dependency in the particular context of your story. What have you learned from your experience with and your decision to narrate these webs of maternal, technological, and extra familial interdependency? And are there takeaways at the level of personal practice, policy, or collective imagination that you would like your story to imbue in its readers? Thank you for writing this beautiful book.
Wow, thank you all so much for such generous and generative readings. I don't even know where to start, but I think I will start by addressing the question about parenting and the sort of ethics, the broad ethics of writing a memoir like this. And I really like that phrase, right to opacity. I've never heard that before, but that's really powerful. So I think one of the first things I had to get my head around when I was deciding to write this book is whether I had the right to write this book, right? Whether it was the right thing to do, whether it was good for me personally, whether it was something that I would feel proud of or feel I could stand by years down the line, you know, as my daughter gets older. And you can't anticipate all outcomes. And there is a difference between having, when I started the book, a 2-year-old who didn't talk back and having a now 6.5-year-old who is very curious about things and asks a lot of questions. So it is different. It's different when you're writing a book like that, when you have a baby and when you're thinking about these questions than as your kid gets older. So I think when I sort of weighed the ethics of writing the book, the thing that I tried to remind myself of throughout the process is that I was writing a book about parenting and about my own experiences and my own, challenges and things that I brought into it and my own, ways of grappling with this. And that I was, obviously it's a web, and the web metaphor is one that I use a lot. And it's a web that tangles a lot of people, and you can't help but write a book, a memoir like this, without entangling a whole lot of people in it. And that was something that I did, even knowing that it was a tricky thing to do. But again, going back to the web metaphor, part of writing it for me was also connecting. So it was writing about people in my life, writing about family, writing about, my, not just my nuclear family, my extended family. But in kind of building that web, in writing about them, I also did feel like I was connecting to them more deeply in a lot of ways. I write quite a bit about my mother, who's probably on the Zoom right now. So, my mom. I wrote about my mom's story. My mom, who my brother was born in the 70s, and he was born with an intellectual disability. And I thought of it as kind of a Russian doll narrative, where I had my story of motherhood, and in that Russian doll of my mom's story of her experience of motherhood. And then I also looked historically at the story of Pearl S. Buck, who in the 1930s had a daughter with an intellectual disability. So I kind of tried to build this kind of Russian doll style narrative around my experience of motherhood. So yeah, so I think it's the double-edged sword of the web. The web is the thing that can kind of entangle other people, even when they don't want to be entangled in it, but it's also the way we connect to each other. And I think that was, at the end of the day, a risk that I was willing to take. So that's my answer to that question. And I don't know that I always do it well.
Can I just say,
Yes, yes.
Did you ever put something in a draft and then about your daughter and then be like, nope, I'm gonna, I mean, you don't have to share it with us
100%,
now, but yeah, so they were, okay.
Oh yeah, 100%. And there have been things I've written subsequently that I thought about writing and then decided not to. For me, writing about her, I had in my head, the cutoff point was preschool. And it was in some ways an arbitrary line in the sand, but I was like, after preschool, she's going to be a kindergartner, and she's going to have her own story to tell. She's going to start writing. She's going to start, right, like expressing herself more. And that felt like a clear cutting off point for me for sort of ending the narrative there. And I've since, there've been, the story continues, and there's things that I thought about writing, and I haven't been able to get my head around the ethics of writing about her now. So that's definitely something that I'm still kind of grappling with and thinking through. And there was a lot that ended up on the cutting room floor. A lot of things that I tried, I wrote about, and then I said, I don't like the way that feels. I don't like the way that that's going to feel. And, hypothetically in 10 years, and reined it in or cut it. Yeah. So that is my attempt to answer that question, but it is like the trickiest thing. I mean, it's really the trickiest thing about a book like this, and it gets at the existential question of whether to do it or not, and whether it's worth doing it. And I think that goes to your question as well about why write a book like this in the first place? Who are you writing it for? What is the purpose of a memoir? I happen to also be teaching a memoir class right now, which has been really fun. It's the first time I've taught a class on memoir. And that's the question that I ask my students kind of every time we pick up a book. Why write this book? What's the purpose of a book like this? And some of the things that we talk about a lot in that class is there's obviously there's a therapeutic side, but you don't publish a book out of therapy, right? You don't publish a book because you had a great therapeutic experience. I don't think anybody wants to read that book. But there is also the side where you feel like you're trying to articulate something historically or culturally that you feel hasn't been articulated in the way that you've experienced it. And that's how I would describe it. I had not read anything that described the experience that I had with pregnancy and motherhood. And I wanted to write something because I felt, again, sort of in this very hypothetical, very abstract way, I felt like, and from having conversations with friends, I knew that there were people who had similar experiences that weren't being written about in the way that I felt like they could be written about. So a little bit of that's hubris, right? Feeling like something hasn't been said and feeling like you can say it. But it was specifically on the way that medical technology had changed and the way that pregnancy is changing. And I could say it's still changing so fast. I mean, when I was doing genetic testing, I think, what's the panel? It was like 105 genetic disorders, and now it's 500? Yeah, I mean, but I mean, the standard test now is I'm like asking people in the audience. I think it's like 500 now, right? Yeah. So just in the short time between, writing about these experiences and now, that's hundreds more genetic disorders are being tested. So things are changing really, really fast. And I think I wanted to kind of capture that moment of what it's like to be caught in the crux of that rapid change. Yeah, and it is interesting. People do come up, you write a memoir and people come up to you and they share more of their stories, and you really do have a deeper sense of connection to other people and the things that they've gone through. It's been a pretty incredible experience. And that leads to interdependency, which is that, just to say that I really have felt this book has allowed me to explore that interdependency. I think when I started writing the book, and I think the initial charge of writing the book is, I don't have enough support, right? I don't have enough support. All this stuff, I'm having to manage all this stuff. There's just not enough support. And I think that drove me in a lot of ways in some of the early drafts of the book. And as I was writing it, I think I sort of forced myself to recognize all the support that I was getting, and to think more about the ways that I'm enmeshed and interdependent, and all the people who were giving us help, and try and reflect a little bit more about that. So I think that came out in later drafts. I think as I was drafting it, I was able to kind of sit with that appreciation a little bit more and understand myself as part of kind of a wider, network of interdependence. So that was a long run through of answers.
It's great.
Anything that I missed?
Oh, yes.
Yes, I missed a lot.
Yeah, because it flows. Your book is just beautiful. Like you read and it just feels like it just flows. But then when you look at it, you do go from the personal to the art to literature. And so I'm wondering
To the historical.
And so for anyone out here, I just thought, or listening, that might be considering wanting to aim to write as beautifully and include what you did. What's your formula? Like, did you have like an outline, or did it just flow? If it did just flow, can you just make up something and say it didn't flow? And yeah, so because it is wonderful how you connect the art and the literature. And for those of us who aren't as well read as you are, we learned from that too.
I wish I could say I had an outline. I've always been a terrible outliner, and I always tell my students to write outlines, and then I feel like a fraud because I can never ever stick to an outline. I thought of each chapter as in more schematic terms. I would have in my head, okay, this is the device that I'm exploring, right? So pregnancy test in one example. Okay, I'm going to think about pregnancy tests. And then I would imagine, this sort of braiding. I would imagine that I'd have the device. I would have a historical narrative that I wanted to tell about the device. I would have a sort of artistic corollary, something like a form of art or way of thinking about humanistically about that device that would be a buttress against this more technological way of thinking. But through all that, the thing that would be kind of driving the train is the personal narrative. So what's happening, what's going on in our lives, like how are things moving forward? That was always kind of going to be the train that was driving. And then these other strands I'd try and kind of weave in. So anytime that I felt like I was going down a rabbit hole, or felt like I had too much of the historical context, too much of the art criticism, I would try and kind of step back and make sure that I had the narrative kind of front and center. So those are more editorial, those are more things that I did in the editing of it, and kind of trying to make sure that the balance was right and that they had the right proportion of things.
But you started, can I just ask you to expand on this?
Yeah.
You did start with the devices as the organizing principle. I love it because it feels like there've been a couple of really interesting like museum exhibits on medical devices that incorporate kind of multiple modalities of exploring those devices. A lot of us teach on things like, the history of the pelvic speculum, right, which has such a deeply violent and fraught history. And so I love that. I didn't realize that was how I thought. Maybe that was an editorial decision later.
No, that was
The devices were your organizing principle. Isn't that genius? I love that. That wasn't a question. That was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, and it was very helpful in the writing because it grounded the text, you know, always having that device as kind of the background against which I was telling the story. That really, for me, helped kind of ground the narrative. Mhm.
I thought maybe it had come in later.
Yeah.
I can, unless there's any kind of further responses, or shall I open things up to the floor? Okay, well, so if anyone has questions or comments, and we have a microphone, so if you just put your hand up, we can come on over.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for excellent questions and readings. As such an accomplished scholar, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges and affordances of writing a different kind of book, of writing a memoir versus
Yeah.
writing an academic monograph, which of course you have done successfully.
Mhm.
If there were certain freedoms in writing for a trade publication versus maybe some constraints that you weren't expecting. Did you ever sort of envision this as perhaps a more sort of typically scholarly
Mhm.
kind of work? Were there times where you thought about that genre shifting?
Yes, that's a great question. So I just to start by saying, and this is a terrible thing to say to someone who's writing an academic monograph right now, but it was so liberating. It was amazing. It was so great. I enjoyed it so much. It was really, it was so fun to be able to, I mean, even though the topic is difficult, it was so fun to be able to write, without the kind of shackles of academic exposition and argumentation and rhetoric, and I think that was part of why I kept writing. You know, I was really enjoying it. Like I felt like a real charge and electricity in the writing process. As far as things that I had to remind myself of, there were definitely the moments where I would say I'm getting too academic, you know, and those are hard to recognize when you've been writing in an academic vein. It's sometimes hard to recognize those moments. But I would often, again, this idea of like the story's got to drive the train, right? Anytime I felt like I was giving too much detail, too many rabbit holes, right? Too much nitty gritty kind of stuff, I would try and remind myself to have a lighter touch, right? Just like a light touch here, right? A little bit of history, a little bit of background, but do it with a light touch. And I can't say I was always successful. Like the academic training kind of like comes in sometimes, but that was the thing that I kept trying to remind myself. And the other thing that was hard, that was kind of difficult, is sometimes I would think, but I'm not saying anything new, right? There's so much scholarship out there about these devices. There's so much scholarship out there about, you know, all these issues. I'm not saying anything new, right? I haven't discovered anything. I'm not in an archive. And when I got into that sort of self-critical mode, the thing that I had to tell myself was, my story is the new thing. Like I'm the archive, which is weird, which is really weird as a scholar, but like the lived experience is that's the archive, that's the scholarship. And so, yeah, but I did recently, I was showing my students Zotero, and I was looking, I always do my notes in Zotero, and my dissertation was like, you know, 30 files with, you know, 20 documents each. It was like this huge mess of citations. And I opened up the Zotero file for this, and I was like, oh, that's such a lovely space to be in. You know, it was like it was a nice amount of research. It was research where I felt like I was digging in and learning and sharing some knowledge, but not just crushed by the weight of it. Sorry for everyone writing a dissertation, right?
Can I just add, and even if people didn't read the book, feel free to ask questions, but also that's not completely true what you said, because it's not just your story. You pushed me to think about devices and motherhood in ways I hadn't thought about. And I kept thinking, wow, coming from your background it's such a unique, yes, it's your unique story, but you have these broader insights that I hadn't read anywhere before. So there is a lot of newness in here. There's a lot of new ideas.
Thank you.
No, I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you all so much and congratulations, Emily. I wanted to ask you about something you said earlier when you described the book as a love story, because when you said that, of course, it clicked. And I thought about this beautiful book again and thought, of course, it's a love story. But I also want to know more what you mean by that. What does it mean to tell a memoir that's about falling in love with people, maybe also with the story itself? And why does it matter that this is a love story? Why does it matter that we know this is a love story? And was there some moment when you knew that that was true about the story that you're telling?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm going to keep saying that. That's a great question. When did I know it was a love story? The first chapter that I really explicitly thought of in those terms was the chapter about hearing loss. The chapter which is both reflections, so I'm going to embarrass the person in the audience, reflections of meeting my husband, and reflections on my daughter being born, both of whom have hearing loss. So when I was writing that chapter, I kind of had that refrain in my head, like this is a love story, right? That it's a chapter that chapter is about deafness, it's about hearing loss, but it's also about falling in love with a different way of being in the world. And I really wanted to tell it that way. And I think especially, as a way of telling, going back to one of your questions, a disability narrative that's a vertical disability narrative, right? That I don't share that disability. I don't myself have hearing loss, but I'm talking about my husband, I'm talking about my daughter. And the way that I interpreted that verticality was as a love story. That's the way that I approached it. So that was my refrain throughout that chapter. But then I think as I kind of reflected back on the book as a whole, that was really important to me to bring into every chapter, including things like the double helix metaphor, right? And one reason that I think for this book in particular that's so important is because I wanted to take these, especially these technological devices, right? Things like glucose monitors, things that are so, that seem so cold or so sort of the antithesis of sort of the warmth and affection that we think of as love. And I wanted to understand what it means to interpret those through the lens of care, of love, of affection. So I think that's why it was important to me.
You also gave kind of that bit where you went into Donna Haraway and the cyborgs and sci-fi, and I really appreciated that attention to that kind of meta attention to what you'd been doing the whole time, which is paying attention to how we human beings and our love are so like spliced together with these devices and our mechanical realities and testing. And I wanted more on the speculative fiction stuff. I was like, oh, I write more. I love this chapter.
I know. And I need to read more speculative fiction. I feel like every day I'm like, this is obviously the direction that my life is taking me. I need more speculative fiction. Yeah. And I just to say the other thing with thinking about love is another way that I approach this book is also thinking about amateurism too, like love as amateurs having the root of love in it. The book took me in a lot of realms, a lot of areas and disciplines that I'm not an expert in, especially in terms of like medicine and science, right? Areas that I'm not trained in. And I approached those as an amateur. And I thought of it specifically in that definition of someone who's approaching it from a place of love, not necessarily a place of expertise or specialization.
So you described Willie as a child with complex medical needs, which I thought was interesting. I was curious if you felt that you had any particular relationship to the label of disabled, if that label had been foisted on Willie in other contexts or by people you felt didn't have a right to do that, or if that's a label you have any particular affinity or disaffinity, if that's the word for it.
Yeah. It's funny. I realize I've been using that term more lately. And I think, especially when you're talking about a a child, she's 6.5 now, and I'm really interested in the words that she's using to describe herself at this point. And she'll describe herself as deaf. She'll say, kids at the playground, she'll say, they'll ask her about their cochlear implant. She'll say, yeah, I'm deaf, right? She's like very straightforward, really owns it, has taken that term. She will say, I have diabetes. She tends to use that construction. I have diabetes. But I've never heard her say I'm disabled. Like that's not a term that I hear her say. Similarly, I have a brother who's intellectually disabled. And so it's a term that I grew up with, right? Disabilities. It's a term that I'm, was a big part of my childhood, big part of, and including other terms that were very popular in the 90s, which was a really great time to, be a kid. And so it's definitely something that I was thinking about. And I was thinking about the way disability had really shaped my mother's experience of parenting and my own experience of parenting. But it's also, right, it's different to see, your child kind of the terms that they use and how they identify themselves. And it's something that I think I'll always continue to learn about her, like how she sees herself in the world and kind of how she classifies herself. Yeah.
So in a lot of the responses, like both from you and also from the audience, I hear that beauty seems to be like a very compelling quality of this book. And you commented on how liberating it was to actually be able to write this kind of book, like in that particular style, perhaps, versus academic writing. To maybe go deeper on that, do you think there is a space within academia too, where maybe this sort of more beautiful, like more maybe memoiristic writing can exist?
Yes, I know some people who are very beautiful academic writers. And I think I had my moments. I think I have my moments as an academic writer. But I think that I think for me, it was partly having a little bit more freedom, freedom to be able to follow the connections where I wanted them to go, or where I didn't know they were going to go. And the sense of surprise that I would get in writing, that I would be able to write and I would be able to be surprised by something that I maybe realized or intuited, but I hadn't actually been able to express before. So I would attribute, if there are any moments of beauty, like I think it's attributable to that kind of surprise, right? Allowing the writing to take me where it was going to go and having that kind of freedom, and then finding something new in the language itself. And again, there are writers who are beautiful academic writers in this room. And I think, and I really appreciate beautiful academic writing, but it's hard won when it comes.
I'm going to go back to one of the questions that came up here. If you maybe you skipped it because you don't want to talk about it, but about how people responded to the book. I'm very curious. I mean, I find it very moving, your recognition within a story that's about considerable difficulty, like your repeated reminder of your good fortune. And I think that's very well taken. So I'm curious about so people who have identified with you, but then also, has anyone disidentified with you? Because this goes to the question about the difference between writing an academic book and a memoir. When you write an academic book, I say this from my own experience, an academic book is about, a intellectual problem. And a memoir is about you, no matter how much you are a constructed character, it's also about you, the author. So I'm just wondering about how people have responded to that, you, and on those different levels.
Well, it's interesting. I think I want to say people have been nice, but now I'm like, oh gosh, what do people really say? I mean, it's been the feedback has been very positive so far. I dare I say, but you do feel vulnerable in a way, right? And parents, especially other readers who've gone through similar things. I think sometimes the people who could be hardest on a memoir are the people who've gone through similar things. I think in some ways those are the toughest readers of especially a parenting memoir. And I find myself doing it sometimes when I read a parenting memoir. You know, you get that the sort of the judgment comes out, right? The sense of, I can't believe they did that, or I can't believe this bothered them, or why was that such a big deal? It's really easy to have those kind of knee-jerk responses, especially when you share common experiences. So I haven't talked to as many people who've had very, very similar experiences, who've read the book, but I could speculate that that might be actually a harder, more challenging reading experience as someone who has more similar experiences. But the ones I've heard from so far, God, I feel like I'm jinxing myself right now. Like I shouldn't say this. Like it's been positive. If anyone wants to, pull me aside afterwards and say, actually, we've all been talking about you. No, but I know that. And I think that parenting memoirs are particularly charged, right? And you see it in online culture around parenting, right? There's so much judgment and it's so easy to feel affronted by, someone else's decisions. Mhm.
I also wonder at this political moment, writing about choice, writing about kind of broadly reproductive justice issues, right? Where
Yeah.
all of it is under attack
Yeah.
and constantly.
Yes.
Was that on your mind as you were writing?
Yes. So I
Well,
will.
so that's another kind of reception.
I
right?
know. I know. I was kind of bracing myself. I mean, maybe just not enough people have read it. Maybe that's the thing. But actually, the Dobbs decision happened as I was writing the book. So one of the early chapters describes a termination for medical reasons, and that was obviously a very difficult chapter to write on a lot of levels. But when I first was writing it, I was writing it in the context of there being such a thing as Roe versus Wade. And when I went back to edit it, when I was looking at it again, it was after the Dobbs decision. So that absolutely colored and impacted the way that I thought about that chapter. Some of the things I took for granted in early drafts of that chapter, I couldn't take for granted in later versions of it. And as the book progresses, I mean, this is a strange kind of memoir because it actually caught up with me in time. So I was writing the later chapters like as almost in real time. So some of the later chapters reflect the Dobbs decision and kind of how the landscape has changed, but the landscape was changing as I was writing it. And the editorial process ended up reflecting that. And I had a lot of really hard conversations with my editor about just how the book was going to land or how certain characterizations were going to land in the context of the Dobbs decision. But it's been, God, I'm like jinxing myself all over the place. I'm very quiet. But we had a lot of conversations, and even down to like what terminology to use and kind of how to approach that conversation.
And again, like, I don't want to jinx myself, but like I'm a children's writer and I work a lot in kind of around book banning culture. And like my experience is that so a lot of my books, which all have to do with like overthrowing oppressive governments and anti-colonialism, like haven't been banned. And so I have this feeling that like I'm not sure that they're reading the books.
Yeah.
These people are banning the books. Maybe just shouldn't go around this room, but I don't think they're reading the books.
Well, and I think books about books that are, I think the ones that really get caught in the crosshairs are young adult fiction, right? Things that are really getting caught in the crosshairs right now.
But your book, you grapple. I mean, it's hard to be judgy about your book because you show yourself grappling with all of this. So no one can say, how could she do that? It's like, no, it's right there. She grappled. She's showing all the sides and everything she's thinking about. And then this is what you decide to do.
Yeah. I don't think anyone could accuse me of not having thought something through. If one of a friend of mine's husband said to me, he said, I feel like you have a really hard time making decisions. Like that's the subtext of this book. And I was like, that's probably true.
I'm gonna ask you a question if I can. You said at the very beginning when you were talking that it was not a rational decision to write this book. And so on the one hand, you were saying in response to the question of why write this, you were saying like that maybe your perspective could be helpful to others. But one of the moments in the book that like really is just so vivid to me is at the very beginning when it's kind of at the very, it's sort of that preface where you're in the playground and then on the way home, you stop at the church steps and you start writing. And you sort of, that seemed to me like the moment where you began to think that you might not just write about this, but write a book about this on some level. And I wondered if, so partly I was thinking about voice and Sayantani's comment about kind of voice and body. And if you could just talk a little bit about the degree to which, even if this isn't sort of just a therapeutic project, that on some level, what was there, how would you describe kind of that impulse to write, maybe before the moment or alongside the moment that this could be helpful? And then on a very practical level, could you talk about writing this in the course of, because I mean, I've, you know, I identified so much also with this, the comment that you made, Sayantani, about nursing and typing. Like it is, I mean, and
You need all my promotion materials.
I mean, I can listen to it also. Like every time I do it, I'm like, am I completely like traumatizing my daughter that like she thinks that like nursing and typing is the same thing? Like it's totally inseparable, you know, right? So, and I mean, I don't know, people don't talk about, you're the first person I've heard just sort of talk about it, right? I couldn't find a desk where I could type and nurse this. So I guess what I'm saying is that at some point, especially when you mentioned the point about rationality, I imagine, based on my own experience of trying to write a book and raise kids, that there were moments where it felt like these things that were so important, you know, that in order to raise your daughter, you needed to write the book, but also in order to write the book, you had to take yourself away from your daughter.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that and how you make sense of that, but also just maybe what the experience of it is like.
Yeah, absolutely. Would it make sense to do like, just read a little bit? Yeah. Is that okay? I just like one.
It's so,
Indulge me, because I think it's a section at the end of the book that I think kind of gets at this. I promise it won't take long.
No.
When I ask Willie what she wants to be when she grows up, she tells me that she is going to be an artist and a doctor and an astronaut. I do not tell her that diabetics are not allowed to be astronauts. I do not tell her that in this country, she'll need a good job with good insurance, the kind that is increasingly rare, in order to afford the insulin that she needs to live. Better stick with the doctor path, kid. Instead, I tell her, yes, you can be all those things. No, mommy, she says, I am an artist, a doctor, and an astronaut. Now. Even better, I say, why wait? Her drawings start to evolve. The color splotches of a 2-year-old give way to the vaguely animalistic and anthropomorphic shapes of a 3-year-old. A distinct style emerges. She calls them her creatures. What did you draw, Willie? It's a creature. Each one has a round circle for a head, a single eye, a curved line for a smile, and straight lines emanating outward for legs. They look like cyclops spiders with big smiles. Every day she comes home from school with a stack of colorful construction paper, each with a series of arachnid creatures. I can flip through them and see a story emerge. One day there are 3 creatures on a page. Mommy, Daddy, and Willie, she declares. She is writing our story, just as I am. I feel a twinge of guilt when I realize that Willie is in preschool so that I can have the time away from her to write about her. I look at pictures and videos of her that I have saved on my computer and imaginatively reconstruct the last 3 years. It is amazing how much I've already forgotten. In one video, she is 2 months old and I'm talking to her. She doesn't have her hearing aids in yet, and I see now what I didn't fully understand then, that she wasn't hearing my voice, but we were still communicating. She could feel me as she sat at my lap and see with her limited infant's vision, the mom-like blur in front of her. Most important, she knew me already. She knew me before she was born. My body communicated directly to her, consoling, soothing, feeding, lulling. And how does that communication compare to what I am doing now in writing her story? Writing about the experience of motherhood is a compromised endeavor. It is in many ways a betrayal of the intense privacy that just the 2 of us language that held us together from the start. And yet I keep writing. I have a web that I feel the compulsion to weave in order to feel less alone. This is my web. It is made of the same stuff that I use to make a life for my child. It is silk, the mother stuff. I don't know if this makes me a good or a bad mother, but I expect that I'm a little of each. And meanwhile, Willie draws her creatures, one of whom is meant to be me. I can't help but wonder what kind of creature I am in her eyes. So I'm just gonna let that answer if that's okay. Yeah. Is that it? Are we done? Is that? All right.
Or just say that.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Yes, there's a reception, I think just this way. Yeah. And I'm just going to thank you all again and thank our speakers and thank Emily most of all for this beautiful book.